Welcome to the podcast of the Wizarding School for Composers. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Soa, and as a composer and educator, I've seen firsthand how transformative the right tools and ideas can be for creative growth. Join us each week as we demystify the craft of composition with accomplished guests and explore new approaches to enhance your creativity, productivity, and joy. Whether you're a seasoned composer or just starting out, this podcast is for you. Let's get started. My guest today is Danielle Kuntz. Danielle is a contemporary harpist and notation coach. She is in demand as a guest lecturer at universities across the United States and regularly commissions and premieres new works for harp. Danielle holds degrees from the University of North Texas and is currently based in Michigan. Danielle, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So let's get started back at the start. How did you get started in playing harp? I mean, most kids, when they are learning their instruments in school, like harp is probably not the first thing that comes to their mind.
Yeah, I had a friend who played harp, thought it looked cool, talked my parents into getting me a little harp. You can see that one back in the corner. And just went from there. They got bigger as I went on. Decided I was playing piano also through high school and some of college. Thought about just majoring in piano instead, but realized there was a little bit less competition with harp. I got injured less on the harp, which was great. So just kind of focused in on harp.
Okay, well, that makes sense. So you played harp all throughout college. What is it that you love about your instrument?
I think that what I enjoy first is that it is my instrument. It's the one that I know the best, can navigate the best. But within that, there's just a lot of potential with the harp that we're still trying to develop. So the harp is actually, even though it's one of the oldest instruments, it's also one of the most newly evolved instruments in this modern form. So even 100 years ago, the harp was still very different, much smaller. So we're still trying to figure out how to effectively utilize the modern harp. And I think that makes it really exciting.
That is really exciting. We're going to dig into that a little bit more later on in the episode today, but I'm glad that you mentioned that because it is exciting to see how, writing for harp can otherwise be this mystery. And so apparently it's not just for composers, for harp players too, learning how to navigate this cool new instrument is something that you're working on. And so I mentioned the composers. How did you end up working with composers? Did that have something to do with the fact that, you mentioned that in its current form, harp is such a new instrument?
I really started that just because in school, most of my friends were composers. So that's really how I got my interest in contemporary music, doing these collaborations. My friends wanted to write for harp. They wrote for harp. I was like, what's going on here? So I started delving into a lot of the notation guides out there for harp and realized that there's a lot of gaps in the literature. But also just the thrill of new music is a lot of fun. And new music, the way I perceive it, it's music that's newly composed, so that can span a wide range of styles, types of music. I do definitely do avant-garde, crazy, experimental music, but I also do a lot of very accessible, traditional sounding new music. So for me, it's just I love working with composers who are alive that I can actually interact with and collaborate with and be part of the creative process and bringing their music to life. So that's really what got me excited about new music. That's why I've really focused in on that throughout my career. But it started out just with friendships. Yeah.
Yeah. So that friendship base and the fact that you can interact with these composers. Do you, I want to ask one more question before we dive into the meat of this podcast. I want to ask one more question on that front. Do you have any memorable collaborations or times that you've worked with composers where you've just been like, yeah, this is why I'm here. This is why I love working with composers on new pieces?
There's quite a few, but since we've been thinking back to college, I think my first big memorable performance was, my junior or senior year. It was my junior year. It was a very crazy semester. I actually had a bunch of not very good performances just because of the level of stress and the amount of repertoire I was trying to learn. But I also had this premiere of this new piece. It was really the first big collaboration I had done. It was a piece that I didn't think was going to work because it was very new to me, the different, the rhythms and the techniques and everything. But I played it first for my harp studio just to get a performance out there before the actual concert. And that connection, I had never really experienced that, just playing regular standard music. It's just, the air was electric. Like that really weird experience. It's hard to describe, but like where you can tell the audience is really resonating with the music. And this is the harp studio. This is when wasn't like the new music people there, but it's like, that's when I was like, oh my God, like number one, this piece works. Number two, I just created a new experience, both for myself and for the audience. And the actual premiere for the composition departmental performance, it was really the same thing. And that's really what got me excited about performing again, especially new music. But honestly, the more I play new music, the better I get at performing other music as well. Like my auditions have been a lot more solid since I did new music, just because, I don't know, it helped me get over the nerves and the stage fright.
That's awesome. I think that's a really cool experience. I mean, this is, whether we're composers or performers, this is what we're here for. We're here to have that sort of electric connection with an audience and to make that for them.
I didn't even think that was possible until that first performance. But like, it's kept going. And yeah, it's really cool. And it's really special for me to actually be part of this creation of new music. Like, I'm not a composer yet, but I love being part, like the composer comes up with the initial ideas, and then I love being the one who helps realize them, like into actual audible music in that sense. So even though I'm not the one initially creating the ideas, I love being part of it.
Yeah.
In that way.
So when you're collaborating with composers, what does that collaboration tend to look like, other than like, here is music, play?
It really depends on the person. Like, they all look very different. It really depends on, like, where the composer is, like what experience do they have writing for the harp? Is it more of like a educational endeavor? Like, am I, consulting with them, teaching them? Is that why they came to me? Or is it because they have a piece and they have experience, but we're trying to work together on this piece? It really just depends on, our relationship. But generally speaking, I do like to see sketches early in the process if possible, just so we can, refine those before developing into a full piece, especially if it's a composer that's less comfortable with writing for the harp. That's where we can actually make the tweaks, and then that can develop into, a full composition versus having to rewrite an entire composition, which is never fun for anyone. But it really depends on, the composer, the collaboration, the scope of the project. It's been everything from a composer just sending me a piece of music and I play it and I love it, and then I record it, to someone that we're actually working through, like, measure by measure together in that sense.
Yeah.
And everything in between.
Yeah, that does sound like quite the range of different possibilities. Well, and that brings us to the meat of what it is that we're going to talk about today, is writing for harp for composers. I was talking with one of my composition students about this the other day, and we were ranking which instrument is the most difficult to write for. And I think that, for most composers, harp is probably that instrument where there are just so many different pitfalls and challenges that writing for harp can just, feel like this big mystery box. It can feel like this big challenge of like, how do I do this? On the one hand, it seems like it should be so familiar. I mean, like, literally see all the strings, and it seems like it's a straightforward thing. But on the other hand, like, you go to write for it, and then you discover that, oh, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. And you can actually do this other thing that it just doesn't really make sense. So what we're going to talk about today, and the meat of what we're going to discuss, is, what are like the 4 big pitfalls, or the 4 things that composers should avoid when writing for harp, so that they can write a really successful harp piece. So maybe just to start out, could you give us like an overview of those 4 key considerations for writing for harp, and then we'll dig into them one by one?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really kind of the curriculum that I teach to composers, whether it's in, consults, courses, workshops, that I found really works well. I will say that a lot of composers really focus in on the pedals, which is fantastic. And we will talk about the pedals because it is absolutely important. But a lot of the unplayable or awkward music that I encounter actually has to do with some of these other areas. So they're just as important as the pedals, I promise. And to preface all of this, one of the reasons why the harp is such a difficult instrument to write for is, just as I mentioned at the beginning, the harp is changed a lot over the last, 200 years. So that means a lot of the music that we're performing now was actually written for a much different, earlier version of the harp. A lot of the music that you are studying on IMSLP is different than was not written for the modern harp. And also, harpists have tweaked to be able to make it playable. So a lot of what you see in the public domain is not actually what is played. So that being said, that's why we're really starting from the bottom, just to build this foundation on how to write for the harp, because we can't really rely on the older music. We can't really rely on the literature just because that's also evolved along with the harp. Some of the changes that we've seen with the harp is, number one, the different mechanics. So going from like the triple strung harp to the cross strung harp, to the single action pedal harp, to the double action, which is what we have today, the different mechanics for achieving chromaticism. You also have different sizes of the instruments. So that means that the string spacing between the older harps and the modern harps is a little bit different. The tension on the strings is different. So that's going to affect how quickly you can play, how loud you can play. It's changed a lot. So we're starting from the beginning and we're working now. We're at the point where the harp has been pretty stable in its modern form for a little while. 50 years, honestly, it's changed a lot. But we can really start to, codify how we write for the harp. So the 4 areas that I like to think of with writing for the harp is, number one, thinking through the playing mechanics. So like, how is the harpist actually playing the harp? How does that translate to the notes on the page? How can you manipulate the notes on the page to either better fit the hands or expand beyond that and stretch that a little bit? Or what happens when the notes on the page do not actually correlate with how we're playing the harp, which can happen a lot. The second has to do with, again, just the pedals and the chromaticism. And then there's also different types of harps. So we have lever harps as well as pedal harps. So we can briefly discuss those differences. But that goes into, if you have chromaticism in your piece, if you're going beyond just the regular 7 notes, what do you do with that? Third is utilizing the full range of the harp. So each register of the harp sounds very different, has different capabilities, different strengths. So we can talk through how to actually utilize it instead of being stuck in the middle. And then the third is just making sure that the music is readable, it's clear. Because harpists play by sight, not by feel, the strings feel very similar, especially in the same registers. So harpists are always looking very quickly between strings, music, conductor, strings, music, conductor. So that we have this triangulation effect, which means we have to be able to quickly look at the music, see where we are, look back at the strings, and have this back and forth. So legible, clear music. There's also lots of little notation quirks for the harp, but the big thing is just make it clean, make it readable. Please and thank you there.
Cool. So what I'm hearing, just to sort of summarize, is playing mechanics, pedals and chromaticism, registers, and readability. Those are the 4 things I'm hearing.
Exactly.
Awesome. I think that's a great list. And I'm very excited to dig into these things with you. And it's also just really fascinating to hear about the history of the harp. I'm actually going to take these in maybe a little bit of a different order. I mean, you mentioned that composers tend to be fascinated by pedals. And I actually have this quote here that sort of amplifies what it was that you're saying about, first there was this sort of like cross string kind of harp, and then there was like the single action harp, and then there was even a chromatic harp at one point. So in his book Orchestration, Walter Piston, this is like one of our common orchestration texts, he mentions a couple of different types of harps, but explains that they are now, quote, entirely superseded by the far more versatile diatonic double action harp. You mentioned that as well, that this double action harp, but can you walk us through both of these parts? He says it's a diatonic harp, and he also says it's double action. What are those 2 things telling us?
Yeah, so the first thing, diatonic, basically just means that you have your core 7 pitches in there. So, and there's probably a better definition that I'm not thinking of at the moment. But on the harp, you have your 7 pitches. So that corresponds with the white keys on the piano, essentially. So, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. In order to then get your chromatic, so in order to get the full 12 chromatic pitches that you would have available, you have to be able to change pedals or change levers or in some way alter the pitch to be able to expand beyond the diatonic layout. So with the double action pedal harp, you have a pedal that corresponds with each of the diatonic pitches or pitch classes if we're going to be strict about it. Mm-hmm. So you have your C pedal that it can change all the Cs on the harp, not just one. So a lever harp, you would be changing a lever that only affects that one specific pitch. It's cool. There's different capabilities with the lever harp, which might be a discussion for another day. You can actually do a lot with the lever harp, but the pedal harp gives you a little bit more consistency throughout it, especially if you're writing tonal music. You have to be able to change all the pitches. So C pedal changes all the Cs on the harp, and it's called double action because there's two notches. So basically the pedal is connected through the pedal rods, through the column of the harp, into the action of the harp, which has these, levers and rods that will then go and turn a disc to raise the pitch of the string. So the first action will change the string from flat to natural. Then you have the second action. If you put the pedal all the way down, it changes the second disc to bring it from natural to sharp. So each string can go through two steps to produce three different pitches. Three different pitches. Along with that, so then we have, the D pedal that affects all the Ds on the harp, B pedal, and so on. So there's 7 pedals, 7 pitches, 7 diatonic pitches, but then you produce more pitches by changing the pedals.
So one of the things that I think is cool about the harp is that in some ways, the fact that the harp is a diatonic instrument actually matches up better with staff notation. Because the 5-line staff is inherently diatonic in the same way that the harp is inherently diatonic. But what this means for harp that I think is so interesting and cool is that, if you look at a piano, there are 12 pitch classes, like you said. But on a harp, because it's a diatonic instrument, there are 21, right? Because you have all of the flats, all of the naturals, all of the sharps. And I think that's just really cool.
You get into enharmonics, which on the harp are actually a thing, because other instruments like the piano, it's enharmonic. It's more of a theoretical thing because D sharp and E flat, you're playing the same key. There's a theoretical difference, but there's not actually a physical difference. On the harp, E flat and D sharp are 2 different strings, 2 different pedal configurations. The timbres are a little bit different. You have different options depending on which one you use. So that's what's really cool about the double action pedal harp. Funny thing is, when the double action pedal harp came out, that was around the era of Berlioz, who in his book said, "Oh, this is all fine and good, but where's the triple action pedal harp?"
What would that even be?
Of course.
Yeah, right? But seriously, what would a triple action harp even do for you?
A headache, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. It's just
you would get, it would be very complex because you have enharmonics, but you have way more enharmonics. You'd also have more pedals, changes. The harp would probably weigh at least 30 pounds more for the extra action. Yeah, I don't see how it would be effective.
We can throw that onto the large pile of failed ideals by Hector Danielle.
I love that.
So anyway, this relates to the chromaticism. So, we have a diatonic double action harp. So because it's a diatonic instrument and we have this double action, what does that mean for how to write chromaticism on the harp?
So that's basically telling you need to plan out your chromaticism. So the thing that I try to reinforce to composers is you only have access to 7 pitch classes on the pedal harp or pitches on the lever harp at a time. You can expand beyond that. You can change which of those 7 pitches you have at any given time, but you only have 7 at any given time. Those 7, though, do not have to be a strict diatonic scale. You don't have to be stuck in G major or A flat major. You can have different configurations to give you access to different 7 pitches, but it's still only going to be 7 pitches at a time. Yeah. So that means you just have to plan out when you're going to be making those shifts, and those shifts are going to require pedal changes.
Do you have any good examples about this from the literature, the chromaticism?
Yeah. So one of my favorite examples actually with chromaticism, there's a lot out there. One of my favorite is Holst's The Planets, simply because that piece uses 2 harps to be able to expand the chromatic capabilities. So Mercury is basically bitonal. But in order to achieve that, you have 2 harps, one that's set, I believe, in E major and one that's set in B flat major. And the harps just alternate every measure to be able to get that chromatic feel or the bitonal feel throughout the piece. But that would not work quite as well with a single harp, just because you'd have so many pedal changes going on. You'd be shifting so quickly and you wouldn't have time to be able to make those shifts. So that's a cool example where you can use two harps to be able to achieve more chromatic effects than you would be able to do with a single harp. Another example would be the Debussy Dances, which was actually, funny story, written for the chromatic cross-strung harp that came around, when was it, 1940, I believe. Don't quote me on that. It was not very well received. It was just a heavy instrument. It didn't really give the chromatic flexibility that people were hoping for. So we went back to the double action pedal harp. So this piece was then transcribed for the double action pedal harp. But there's a couple sections, very famous section, that has too many pedal changes. We have to either leave out a note or completely rewrite it in more sharps rather than more flats, because there's just no way to be able to get all the pedal changes that you would need to do.
Interesting. When
But
you're
it's WC Dances, it's on all the auditions, so we all have to figure out how to play it. I mean, it's a cool piece, don't get me wrong, it's a cool piece, but it's still kind of funny. It wasn't written for the double action pedal harp, which is what we all play today.
So we were just talking about chromaticism and pedals and how to use that sort of thing, but you mentioned that's typically not your starting point in teaching composers how to write to harp. Instead, where you typically start is having to do with the playing mechanics. Now, a lot of composers, when they start writing for harp, harp is this really big foreign thing, but for many composers, the piano is the familiar thing. So maybe can you talk us through, just to start with, how is writing for harp so different than writing for piano? And you're a great person for this because you've played both instruments.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't get too scared because, yes, there are a lot of similarities with the harp and the piano. So if you know how to write for the piano, there's a lot that can translate to the harp, especially if you know how to write well for the piano. I was actually talking to a friend of mine, does a lot of this collaborative type work on piano, and I was listening to one of her lectures on writing for the piano. I was like, she's saying the same things I am. The thing with the piano is you have a lot more dexterity, a lot more flexibility, so you have a lot more ability to work around less optimal writing, whereas with the technique of the harp, you have more limitations. Unfortunately, it's true. So the big differences then between the harp and the piano, the first is that on the piano, you really have a single action to be able to play a note. So you're either using your arm to drop down or your fingers to drop down, but it's a single action. On the harp, you actually have multiple actions to be able to play a note, just because you're going from this angle, which gives you a lot of dexterity, to working really against gravity with more of this angle. And you can notice my fingers really cannot move quite as fast.
Yeah.
Along with that, on the piano, to play a note, you're simply pressing a key. Whereas on the harp, you're having to actually come around a string, put tension on that string, pull the string, come back on the string. So I call that, like, there's the four motions of playing. So you place, you press the string, you close, which is what we consider playing, but then you have to reopen. So that just takes a little bit more time to be able to play a note on the harp than it does on the piano. But harpists don't have to pluck individual strings quite in that same way. We use this concept of blocking, which if you write for the piano, pianists do use this too, just not quite as strictly, where you're going to be placing multiple notes together. So instead of doing these four motions of playing individually for each note, you can place multiple notes, press, and then you can either play them individually, you can play them together, then you open, and then you replace on notes. So harpists are really thinking more vertically in the music, even when the notes are written horizontally. So things like the Nutcracker cadenza, we're placing those notes together, even though it's an arpeggio, those are all played individually. We're placing them together. We're thinking of them in blocks of notes. So this concept of blocking is what I try to reinforce. If you're writing for the harp, you want to be thinking in these blocks. So 3 to 4 note blocks, because harpists, again, we only use 4 fingers. The pinky finger is too short to actually fit on the harp. So 4 notes max in a block, but that's your max. So your average can be maybe 3 in there. We can also get into spacing a little bit, and that's a really big topic. But the main gist of that is that harpists, our hands are playing in the same direction. So they're oriented together, versus piano, where you're playing, your hands are opposite directions. So that means thumbs in the middle, fingers on the outside. So if you're thinking of natural finger spacing on the piano, you're always going to be thinking larger interval on the inside, smaller ones on the outside. Again, there's a lot of nuance within that just because you have more dexterity and different voicings work better. But at the base level, larger intervals on the bottom, on the inside, smaller ones on the outside. Whereas on the harp, the hands are oriented in the same direction, thumbs on top, fingers on the bottom. So you generally want to have your larger intervals on top because of the way that the hands are spaced. It's a lot trickier to get a smaller interval on the top. And that brings the whole hand up, which means you can't reach as far. So the most awkward intervals out there are the ones that have really small intervals on the top, really large ones on the bottom. So to summarize, large intervals on top, small ones on the bottom. And you have a lot of flexibility within that as long as you just kind of adhere to that general framework and thinking in blocks.
Very cool. I love the way that you're summarizing this. One way that I've thought about it, I'm curious to hear your take on this, is that the way that I've sort of thought about writing for harp is that it's kind of like writing for piano, but if you had two left hands and no pinky. Would that be a fair way of saying it?
Yep, that's a great summary of that.
Yeah.
Two left hands. And again, your left hand's a little bit slower on the piano. Harp's a little bit slower. But then that also, I don't know if we're ready to move on to the next category, but if you're thinking of the harp as a slower instrument, that really doesn't give enough credit to the resonance of the harp and the way that the harp actually behaves. So on the piano, the sound immediately dampens. So you take your finger off the key, you have that automatic dampening mechanism, unless you're working around that with a damper pedal. So you have this clean sound, which means that you can play fast without losing that clarity within reason. On the harp, however, if you play a string, it's going to automatically sustain. It's going to keep ringing unless you come back with a second motion and stop the sound. This is pretty much the opposite of every other instrument out there except pitched percussion, which harp is technically pitched percussion. So you play a note, it's going to keep ringing and resonating unless you come back and stop the sound. So that means that playing more notes is not always going to be louder, because in order to play more notes, you're going to be stopping the sound of other notes. If you let the notes ring, that's actually how you're going to create a larger sound. So sometimes less is more on the harp. But each section of the harp does not ring in the same way just because of the differences in register. So I like to break this down into actually 4 registers of the harp. You have your lowest register, which has wire strings. So that's where you get a lot of the clarity and sound just because of that more metallic material. Those are also the strings that are going to ring forever. So some of those will ring up to a minute unless you are coming back to stop the sound. So you can get some power in those sounds. It's great. The mid register of the harp, so I kind of break that into 2 categories. So you have your mid-low, which starts from about middle C down about an octave and a half. That's the area that we tend to call muddy just because you have gut strings there. So it's a warmer sound. You don't have that precision or the clarity that you would have with the wire strings, but those strings are still going to ring a long time. So if you have too many of those ringing at the same time, number 1, it's going to sound muddy. Number 2, those strings are ringing, vibrating, which means coming back on the strings, you have a high risk of buzzing. So having too many strings going at the same time in that mid-low register can be problematic. So that's where you want to use more open voicing. And again, the less is more way of thinking. And then your mid register starting from about middle C up, again, an octave and a half, 2 octaves or so. That's your mid register of the harp. So the resonance is less. It still is going to be resonant, but they won't ring quite as long. But you still have that warmer sound from the gut strings. So that's really your sweet spot with working with the harp. You don't have to worry quite so much about the resonance and the buzzing or the muddiness just because of that's really your sweet spot register. And then the top register of the harp, most harpists will use nylon strings. Not all, but most. And that gives it a really bright, clear sound. But those are the strings that decay almost immediately. So those will ring for like a second, maybe. So you get that ping. You just have the attack and then it dies away, which is actually really effective in large ensemble work because you can use that to accentuate the sound of other instruments. So like pairing that with like a flute, it's really good. But the harp again, it doesn't all work in the same way. So being aware of the register that you're writing in, how it's going to behave, how it's going to ring, can help inform you how to utilize it, how to write for it. And you can experiment. You can see, okay, do I want this in a lower register? Or do I want this specific pattern? Maybe I need to move that pattern into a different register to be more effective.
So this would be the third thing that you're giving for composers. So we talked about like not winging it with the chromaticism. We talked about, understanding the mechanics of what it's physically like to play. And now we're talking about the different registers. I think that's really fascinating. I'm glad that you broke those registers down for us in those different ways. Do you have any, again, I want to go back to the literature on this. Do you have any examples of pieces from the literature that show off this understanding of registers and resonance?
So, yeah, there's a lot out there. I'm focusing a little bit more on like orchestra excerpts today. One of the ones I like especially is the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Dukas, just because it really effectively uses the full range of the harp in an orchestral setting as far as timbres. I will say, though, that this one does not work so well with the playing mechanics. And there's big sections where we've had to edit it just because it goes so fast and you're actually not going to hear it. So I think I don't remember the rehearsal numbers offhand, but there's sections where you have both hands playing that we just drop the left hand and play the right hand. Because it's in that high register, it would be more effective in the orchestration just to play that register louder. You'd hear that more than playing two hands not as loud because you can't physically play it that loud and that fast. But that's a good one to study just to kind of see how these different registers are going to interact in a larger orchestral setting.
Very cool. And it's a great piece too.
It's a great piece.
That's excellent.
It's so fun to play if you actually play the edit.
Well, I mean, you mentioned this edit thing, and I'm curious, is there a place like, where do harpists find these edits? Is there some sort of like secret like harp club where like, you give like the harpist handshake and they're like, hey, here's the Dukas edit, like.
Might think you're exaggerating.
Yeah. Well,
but this pretty much, these rewrites are like passed down from like teacher to student. And we have these horrible photocopies from like 3 generations ago with these rewrites. And it irks me so much because how is this helping anyone? Because composers are then studying, IMSLP, but no one plays the harp scores as written in there. So we're still trying to work on codifying it. There are some good publications out there. The Principal Harp by Sarah Boulin, I think that's published by Vanderbilt Music. She has 2 volumes of a lot of orchestral rewrites that could give you a really good idea of what a lot of harpists do. But because we're coming from these different teacher camps, not everyone does these edits in exactly the same way. So different teachers will be like, oh, this one takes too many liberties. I want you to play this version, sort of thing. So it's not completely codified quite yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense that it wouldn't be. When you have an entire 200-ish years of orchestral literature that would need rewriting. And so that's a lot of literature.
And because of the whole harp evolution thing, a lot of this music was written for earlier harps. So like Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique was written for a much smaller double action pedal harp, which meant you could play it faster. You couldn't get as much sound. Hence why there's 4 harps in that part. But it's also written very awkwardly. That probably did work on that harp just because you can move quicker. But it's so awkward on the modern harp. So awkward.
Interesting.
I don't like that piece at all, if anyone's wondering.
Okay, so listeners out there, do not study Berlioz as an example of how to write for a modern harp.
It's so hard and it's so awkward, and you can't hear the harp at all after the first page.
Yeah.
So the orchestration and the way that it's written. So I could go on a big long rant about that, but I will spare you all for now.
I do feel like this is just a general orchestration principle, is that if you're going to write, particularly if you're going to write a difficult passage. So, I mean, I'm talking with you, obviously, about harp stuff, Danielle, but I've spoken with other orchestral musicians in the past, and one of their most common complaints is composers will write them these horrendously difficult passages that they spend, hours woodshedding in the practice room. And then they go to the rehearsal and they realize that no one can hear what they're playing. It's just so demoralizing.
Yeah, story of my life. I mean, Don Juan Strauss is another big example of that, because you have these horribly awkward arpeggios, which, yes, we can make it work. Yes, we actually drop notes because in the orchestration, you're not going to hear it and you're trying to just to get the effect, and we'd rather just get the effect than play what's strictly written. I think just from seeing orchestral scores from composers I've worked with who've come with me to consult, I think one of the biggest issues is that they're trying to include too many voices in the harp part. Yeah. So instead of, there's the violin line, there's the winds line, there's whatever the low strings are doing, then the harp ends up doubling everything and then sometimes having some independent stuff as well, which is great in theory. Sometimes that's what you would do with the piano if you're adding a piano into your orchestration, but it ends up just being too many notes and the harp does not need to double absolutely everything. So the harp can be a filler, the harp can double a line, maybe two if you're careful, but be really intentional about how you're using the harp. It can be really effective if you use it well.
Yeah.
Or it can be a pain if you just give the harp like a reduction of the score.
Yeah, that would be a total pain. Well, I want to come up on this fourth thing that a composer should avoid. But before I do that, I have one more question of in my own study of the harp and how I've come to learn how to write for it. So I wrote a piece, 3 years ago at this point. That was for flute and harp. I had a ton of fun writing it. But in the process of doing that, I studied a whole bunch of scores for harp. And one of the things that I realized, and again, since you're both a harp player and a pianist, I'd be curious to hear your take on this. So when pianists learn keyboard harmony, like the prototypical keyboard harmony texture, right, is that you have one note in the left hand and you have three notes in the right hand for piano, right? And this is just like your stock basic, plain vanilla. This is the essence of writing for piano, which I think is, once I realized that there's this connection between keyboard harmony and the rest of the piano literature, you can start looking for it. You can realize, even in the craziest Liszt or Rachmaninoff passages, you actually still see that they're thinking in this way.
That makes a lot of sense.
There are a bunch more notes that are happening there. And so when I was looking at the harp literature, something that I noticed, I'm curious to hear your take on this. I feel like the formulation in harp is just slightly different. I mean, you're going to have one note still in the left hand, but instead of three notes, it's two notes. Is that the harp just does not do inner voices as well as the piano.
Right. Yeah. And there's actually, what's kind of funny is that a lot of harpists, just because the literature is pretty sparse for harp, because it's a newer instrument, we end up transcribing a lot of piano music for the harp, which a lot of it's possible. A lot of it, you just bumps it up a level. So if it was like an intermediate piece on the piano, it would be an advanced piece on the harp. If it was advanced on the piano, it would be expert only, do at your own risk, double black diamond sort of piece. But a lot of Bach fugues get transcribed for the harp, and those are just insanely difficult because of all the inner voice work. I mean, it's fun to try, but it's not quite as effective just because of the resonance of the harp. You don't get that same clarity of the voices that you do on the piano. So I like that way of thinking about it.
Okay, cool.
Just, pare it down a little bit. Less is more. You're not cheating. You're letting the harp actually do what it's meant to do, which is resonate. And fewer notes sometimes help it do that better.
I think that's a really cool takeaway. What the harp is meant to do is resonate. So succinct. That's awesome. So let's touch on this fourth thing. The fourth mistake that composers run into is making an unreadable score. What does that look like? You mentioned earlier that, you're doing this triangulation between conductor music and harp. So maybe tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, there's a lot of little picky things within harp notation. We probably don't have time to get into today, but the big overarching thing I want to convey is just include white space on the page. There needs to be space on the page. The reason for that is, number one, we have this triangulation thing going on. Number two, harpists often have to make a lot of markings in the score, whether we're adding in pedal markings or adjusting the pedal markings. Harpists will often add in a lot of extra pedal charts, which you do not need to do. It's okay. We can talk through a little bit of that in a minute. But harpists sometimes, in Wagner, I have a pedal chart every measure just because of how much stuff is shifting. I need to have my restart points. If the score is too compressed, if you have too many notes in a measure, too many staves in a page, there's just not room for any of that especially if we want to write in groupings or write in which hand is playing which notes. We like to be able to make those markings in the music, but there does need to be space for that. Another issue is just sometimes, well, I guess this goes along with that. Sometimes we will play some notes enharmonically just because it works a little bit better. But in order to do that, again, there has to be room on the page for us to make those markings. One example, if you look at the IMSLP version of Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet overture, the last rehearsal section for the harp, it's so squished together. Like there's not much space between the notes. That's a section that we do also do some enharmonics, and it's impossible to read with the original version. So a lot of us just copy and paste in the Sarah Bolen rewrite because we can actually read it there. Organizing orchestral scores as a harpist is a pain, and I feel for librarians who are dealing with this along with us. But moral of the story, just like give us some space. Space.
I think that's a great, simple takeaway of just leave space around the systems, leave margins. I think that makes a lot of sense.
It gives us the room that we need to be able to make adjustments in there. We could also talk about page turns because that is a little bit of a dicey issue. On the piano, you can turn pages with either hand if you need to. On the harp, you can only turn them with your left hand just because the harp's in the way of the right hand. So that means there needs to be space, like the left hand needs to not be playing.
Interesting.
Now, it does not have to be a rest. It can be a long note because unlike the piano, you don't have to actually hold down the note. You can play it, turn the page, and come back. So it can be space in that way. It just needs to be space. A lot of harpists, though, are making the transition to digital tablets, which means that we're turning the pages with the pedal rather than the hand. The ramification is that minimize pedal changes around page turns, which is something you should probably do anyway. Please and thank you. But with the digital tablet, there's page turnings happening every page rather than with a paper score, you have 2 pages, you turn 2 pages. So kind of if you want to play it safe, be careful about left hand, allow space for the left hand to turn the page, and then minimize pedal changes on the page turn.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, I think that we could, be here all day talking about harp stuff, and I think it'd be really fascinating. I love the clarity with which you bring this up and all of the ready examples that you have. I think that's so cool. And it makes sense because you happen to teach a course about harp writing for composers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and when it starts and what it entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was kind of my dream to put something like this together. It ended up being a pandemic project to, build this course out. The reason is I can only give so much information in, an hour lesson or an hour consult because so much of this builds on itself. So this course really just delves into these 4 areas, actually 5, because we do talk about extended techniques also in a 5-week-long format. So a lot of the material's pre-recorded, but this next round, I'm actually going to be adding in some live elements as well. So weekly workshops as well as the video training material. So that's going to start in the late July, and all the details are available on my website with some more information. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to chat. But yeah, that's on my website, daniellekuntz.com/HWC-course, harp writing for composers.
Great. That makes sense. So, and they can go there as well. Your contact information is also there on the website in case they have questions for you.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out. Happy to chat. Feel free to follow me on social media as well. I do a lot of mini harp tip tutorials, things like that. Extended technique demos because that's always fun. Little snippets. So yeah, it's fun.
Very cool. Well, thanks for joining me today, Danielle. I mean, I've personally learned a lot, and I'm sure that the same would be true for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was always fun. Never turned down an opportunity to talk about harp stuff.
Yeah, it's true. I feel the same way about composing stuff. Anyway, take care. We'll see you around.
Thanks.